Hey everyone, Ken and Prava here. Welcome back to another Blender tutorial. This one's going to be a beginner's guide to geometry nodes in Blender. Hopefully make it so geometry nodes are not a scary thing, simplify it down, and make none other than a donut. I know I'm standing on the shoulders of the great ones like Andrew Price, who does his beginner Blender donut series, and not at all trying to distract from that. If you want to learn Blender, that's a great series. Go check that out for sure. This one is going to be specifically focused on geometry nodes. So we're going to create the donut completely 100% in Blender. I am going to provide some materials for you to use, as well as just kind of a startup file with a plate and some lights in there, so that we don't have to waste any time doing those things and we can just use geometry nodes. So if you want to download that startup file totally for free, jump in the link in the description, grab that. You can download it and get started learning geometry nodes in Blender, making some donuts. All right, so if you download my startup file for this tutorial, this is what you'll get. It's just a plate on a simple countertop, and I have all the materials in place so that we can really focus on learning geometry nodes. So there's also a light group in here so that if we press Z and go to rendered view, you can see we have a nice preset basic setting, just kind of an early morning breakfast plate on a table type of donut look. Now with all that out of the way, we can go ahead and create an object to add our geometry nodes network on. So I'm going to press Shift A, and I like to do a cube. You can do any object. I like to just do a cube, and we can name this, we'll just name it donut. All right, and we don't actually need the cube. We're going to replace that with a curve. We can get out of the layout tab and go into the geometry nodes tab. And this creates a new geometry nodes network for us on that object. And you can see it appear in the modifiers panel over here. This group input, this is our cube right there. So if we delete that, the cube deletes. You can see it's really just a placeholder for our object in our outliner up here. So you could add anything. If you wanted to add a sphere in here and connect that up, now the cube is replaced with a sphere. I'm going to press the tilde key and look through my camera, and now I can see my plate again. All right, we obviously don't want a sphere, so let's go ahead and delete that by pressing X to delete. So the first thing we are going to add into our group input here is a curve circle. So I'm going to press Shift A and just search for curve circle and drop that in. And we can connect that up into our output. Now you might not see anything because it's probably beneath the plate, but if we go to wireframe mode, you can see there's our curve right there. You can hide the plate in our viewport and we can see our circle there. Now we need to define a thickness around the curve. So let's set the curve radius. So to do that, we can press Shift A and drop in a set curve radius node right after the curve circle. This will be the radius of our curve once we convert this to a mesh. So now we need to add in a curve to mesh node after that curve to radius. And it's going to look for a profile curve shape to wrap around that curve. And you can see you can drag out and you get this little plus icon. If you unclick, you can then type whatever you need, and it'll do a pretty good job of guessing a lot of times. If it doesn't pick up what you need, you can just type it right there, curve circle. So now it applied this circle curve around this curve with a radius of 26. So you can slide this radius down or up and you can start to get a torus shape or a donut shape. Now let's go ahead and leave that at origin and bring back our plate. I'm going to grab our counter and our plate, shift select them. I'll press G and Z and just slide those down so that our donut is sitting right on top of them. And you can go to the front view. Now I'll grab our donut again, and we can make adjustments to this. You can increase the radius, the overall radius, and then of course you can increase the thickness radius here. So somewhere about like a 0.5 radius and about a 0.235 curve radius. Nice even donut shape. This spreadsheet up here in the top left gives some helpful information about everything you're doing. I'm not really going to use it for this tutorial, but I will change this to the 3D viewport just so that we can have another angle of our donut. And what I like to do is in this viewport, turn off the overlays so that it's a nice clean viewport display. All right, I'm going to grab these nodes we've done so far and slide them over, because now it's time to displace our donut and make it look crinkly, a little more like an actual donut. So I'm going to drop in a set position node after our curve to mesh. And we have these offsets right here that we can use to displace our donut. So I'm going to drag a noise texture into this offset. And instead of the factor, let's take the color out into the offset. Now you'll notice it offsets in a positive direction on the X and Y. So we're going to do something interesting to bring this back to origin and have it displace using the normals of our object instead of just displacing in all three axes. So the way we do this is multiply it by the normal. So I'm going to do Shift A and drop in a vector math node and plop it right in between the noise texture and our offset. And if I grab a normal node, it'll grab the normal of our object and I can feed that into the bottom of that vector math node. Now it's adding the normal to the noise displacement. But if we set this to multiply, you can see our object snaps back to the origin. But our displacement is much too big. It looks pretty funny. So we can control how much displacement we have by duplicating this multiply node and dropping it right in there. And now we have 0 displacement on all three axes. But if we drag this out, you'll see we start to get displacement on our donut object. And then you can increase not only the amount, but you can also adjust the scale of this displacement. So we don't want to go too crazy, just a nice simple donut shape. Something like that. You'll notice some faceted edges on our donut. We'll take care of that later with a subdivision surface node. For now, we want a way to cut the donut in half and make a nice icing top. So this is actually pretty easy to do with another set position node. Let's hold down Shift and right click and create a point on our network right before the displacement, so right before the other set position node. And let's split this down here and take that part into a set position node. So now we've sort of split our network. We have the donut going into here for our displacement, and then everything before that displacement going down here. And the reason is we want to displace the icing in a different manner so that it has a different look than the donut. I'm going to grab these same nodes we used for the donut and press Shift D and duplicate them. And I'm going to feed them into the offset of this other set position node. If we Control Shift click and view that, we can view what we've done here. And now I'm just going to take the scale of this noise down a good bit so that the displacement is a kind of a bigger, smoother displacement. And I also might take up the amount of it. We can come back and adjust this, but this is going to be a Boolean object to kind of cut this donut in half and make some icing. So what I'm going to do is add a transform geometry node right in here. And this allows us to translate, move our geometry in any direction. But I really just want to do it on the Z axis. And I just want it to be a little bit lower than my donut. And now we need a mesh Boolean node. I'm going to take my transform geometry into the bottom of this mesh Boolean node and my donut that we've made up to this point into the top. I'll delete my viewer node and everything will snap back into my geometry output. And now if I orbit around the front view, you can see what we have here. If we adjust this translate value, we start to get the bottom donut cutting into the top donut and creating a nice little icing layer. It's pretty low resolution and faceted, so we can add some geometry here by adding a subdivision surface node. So I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to add a subdivision surface node. Drop it in there. So that helps a little bit, but there's also some more we can do to clean this up. So what I'm going to do is add in an extrude mesh node. And now we're just extruding our icing here. Uncheck individual. We don't want to extrude each individual face, just the object as a whole. And now if we slide that in, we're giving our icing some thickness. So this is obviously a value you'll want to adjust later on. It's still kind of low resolution, but we'll fix that in a minute. For now, let's bring back our donut base layer. So let's press Shift A and drop in a join geometry node and feed that in after this extrude mesh. Let's grab our original donut and join it back in there. So now we can see the icing sitting on top of our donut and we can make adjustments to the thickness. We also might want to scale up the icing so that we make sure it sits right on top. Something like 1.1 is probably good. So now you can see how you can make a fun little animation of the donut being covered with icing. And then if you want to adjust the displacement line of this icing, we have this noise value right here that we can tweak. And of course you can increase the amount of that. All right, after this join geometry node, let's add in a subdivision surface node. And that gets everything looking a lot cleaner. That edge line disappears. And you can increase this as well. And you can see we get a nice smoothed out donut. Already it's looking very edible. We can go ahead and set materials on each of these mesh objects because we have them both separated here. So if we view this, this is our icing. If we view this, that's our donut. So we can set a material on each of these objects. We can do that by using a set material node and dropping that in right there. Now the set material node will allow you to pick any material you have in your Blender file. So if you were to create a new material and call this material A and give it a viewport display color of say green, and you grabbed material A from your set material node, you can see it now turns your donut that nice lime green color. Obviously we probably don't want that. You can use any material you have, or you can use one of the materials I provide for free, which is this nice donut material. And you can see it gives us a nice viewport color. We'll get into rendering later, but for now we can also apply a material by Shift D, duplicating that node, and let's apply one of the icing materials. Let's use that pink icing one, or you could go with the chocolate. Alrighty, that's looking pretty fun. But we're not done yet. We need to add some sprinkles, of course. Now we don't want to add sprinkles to the donut. We really just want to add it to the icing portion of this. So we're going to take this output before it's joined with our geometry, and that's what we're going to feed into a distribute points on faces node. So let's press Shift A and do distribute points on faces and drop in. And now you see a bunch of points distributed over the faces of our icing. I like to set it from random to Poisson disk. And now we have a density max factor slider here, as well as a density factor. Now we'll come back to that because we want to make adjustments to that so that it fits our donut better. But for now, let's use these points created to instance some sprinkles onto our donut. So let's press Shift A and drop in an instance on points node. So the points are fed into the instance on points node. And then we need to join this back up with our geometry. So let's drop in a join geometry node and feed this up into there. Now we can delete our viewer node and we don't have anything. And that's because we're not actually instancing anything onto our donut. So we need an object to instance on our instance on points node. And we can use just a simple cylinder. So if we drop in a cylinder node and feed that into the instance socket on our instance on points, we're now instancing this cylinder all over our donut. But you'll notice it's pretty huge and looking ridiculous. So let's take the radius and the depth way down. We can go something like 0.01 by 0.02. And that might not be quite right, so we can adjust the depth out, something like 0.06. These are pretty high resolution sprinkles. So let's take the total number of vertices down. You can adjust that at any time, but the higher resolution, the more geometry you have in your scene, the more your scene might kind of chug along. I want to rotate this cylinder by 90 degrees on the x-axis. So I'm going to do a transform geometry node and rotate by 90. So now these are all laying flat on our donut, but they still obviously don't look good. But you see, if I just come in here and start rotating these, they rotate all at the same time, and it doesn't really behave like we want. We want the sprinkles to have appeared like they landed on the icing and rotate in a random order. So I actually want this rotation value for my distribute points on faces node. That'll allow me to keep the sprinkles plastered to the top of this icing and then rotate around a single axis. So to do that, we need a rotate rotation node. It's a fun name. Drop in a rotate rotation node, and we can grab the rotation output of our distribute points on faces node and feed that into the top of this. And if we set this to local, and then feed this into the rotation of our instance node, you can see now they all snap to the surface of that geometry. And we can isolate the individual axis of our sprinkles like that. So now the z-axis becomes the pivot point for our sprinkles around the donut. So now we can randomize the z value. And the way we do that is by pressing Shift-A and dropping in a random value node. We don't want it to be a float. We want that to be a vector. So if we feed that into the rotate node, this is now our minimum value x, y, and z and our max value x, y, z. So let's zero out the x and the y because we said we only need to randomize the z. And that allows us to randomize the sprinkle rotation while staying plastered to the surface of our icing. Pretty cool. And now you can make final adjustments to the length and radius of your sprinkles. Now, if your sprinkles are looking too rigid, what you could do after this cylinder shape is drop in a subdivision surface node. And then you might need to increase how much topology is on the individual sprinkles by increasing the number of vertices. That does give you a nice smoother sprinkle. You can even drop in a set shade smooth node as well. And that just smooths out those even more. It all kind of depends on how close up you're going to get to these sprinkles. That determines how high resolution you'll want to make them. Now you'll notice we have an issue here where the sprinkles are coming down below the level of the icing. And if you increase the density of them, then that becomes even more offensive, as you might get more sprinklers kind of straggling below. And that's because there's trying to be points distributed along the bottom of these faces right here. There's a few different ways we could deal with this, but an easy one is to affect the density factor of this with a gradient texture. So what we can do is take a gradient texture directly into the density factor. If we Control Shift click and view our donut, and then Control Shift click and click our gradient, we can view what the gradient is doing on our object. It's going left to right, 0 to 1 value. Obviously, we don't want it going that direction. We need it going the horizontal value of the donut icing. So to affect that, we need a vector rotate node. Drop that in, feed it into the vector of the gradient. And our vector, we need an input vector for this, and it's just going to be the position of our object. Drop that in. So now you can see our gradient returns, but we're able to adjust the rotation value of the gradient. So if we change this from axis angle to y-axis, we can now rotate this by 90 degrees. And we can also adjust the center of it like so by sliding this up. And now you have a nice gradient. So what you can do here is effectively just kind of chop off that bottom layer of faces and tell Blender don't grow any points there along the icing of our object here. So this gives us essentially a mask that we can then use as the density factor for our distribute points on faces node. So I'm going to delete that viewer node, and you can see it's already fed up into the distribute points on faces node into our density factor socket. So now if you slide this value down, you get a way of adjusting where your sprinkles are grown. So if you say, I don't want them distributed on those bottom faces, you just slide your gradient up and it takes care of that. But you'll notice sometimes it makes too many disappear. So we can try to further adjust this gradient. Let me Control Shift click view our donut and then Control Shift click view our gradient. We want a way to make this more pronounced of a line. So to do that, we can drop in a color ramp node and feed that in between our gradient and our viewer node. And now we can further compress this value. Remember, the wider the value, the more points are going to be distributed, and we can further kind of cut off that bottom layer of faces while not affecting too much of our donuts icing. So you can see we'd get a much cleaner mask. Let me delete my viewer node and feed this output now into our density factor. And so now we have a bit of an easier way of controlling where these sprinkles are grown, and it's a lot cleaner. So if you want more sprinkles, you can always increase. And then of course you could adjust this color ramp to decide where they need to be grown. Of course, you want to give the sprinkles a material as well. So Shift A, do set material, and drop it right after your instances, and grab any one of the preset sprinkle materials. I like to use the sprinkles random. And now you have your sprinkles have a nice material. So there you go. You just made a procedural donut using only geometry nodes. So if you wanted to make this into a tool that you can adjust in your modifiers panel, press Shift A and add in a group input node. And now you can feed different settings that you want to adjust just over here into this node. So if I want to adjust the radius of my donut, you can see now radius pops up as a setting that we can procedurally adjust. If I want to adjust the donut thickness, I can feed that into this node, press N, and I can name this donut thickness, for example. And now I can adjust the thickness of my donut. You can do that with all sorts of settings, like the scale of the noise. You get the idea. You can continue to feed different settings like that, such as the density of your sprinkles. You could put that, make that be a factor slider into your geometry nodes tool. In my final donut, I created lots of different settings, including the ability to switch whether or not my donut has icing or sprinkles, different checkboxes for that, as well as material selections for all of the objects in your scene. So if you want to explore that, you can download that file from my Patreon, link in the description. Now, moment of truth. Let's press Z in our rendered viewport, and we should have, if you've got my startup file in there, you should have all the lights in your scene, materials already set, and you have a really nice looking donut. Early morning breakfast time. Looks good enough to eat if I do say so myself. And of course, you can change the material of these as well. If you want to change the icing color to pink, it's all procedural, really easy, just swap out the material. Same thing with the sprinkles. If you want to adjust the color of the sprinkles to say chocolate, there you go, you have that option. All of these settings, totally customizable, totally procedural, and gives you the flexibility to make a donut in Blender using geometry nodes. So that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you have a really cool procedural donut that you can use in any of your projects. You can customize it, and I'd love to see what you guys come up with. So send me the renders, and hopefully this was helpful and useful to you. If you want to download my donut file, you can go grab that from my Patreon, link in the description. Shout out to all my Patreon viewers. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And thank you for watching this. I'll see you next time in the next Blender tutorial.